米国エネルギー省技術開発マネージャーモントレー・ガーディナー様よりご講演いただきます。講演のタイトルは United States and Japan Collaboration through Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Research and Development です。それではガーディナー様にご登壇いただきます。Dr. Gardiner, if you please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Monterey Gardiner. I'm from the U.S. Department of Energy, the Fuel Cell Technologies program. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Dr. Safranis and Dr. Murakami for the kind invitation to come speak here. I've been given an hour, and I think that's probably a bit more time than I need, and probably people will be anxious to move on to the reception and discussion. So I'll probably keep it to a bit shorter. The beginning of this week, I just returned from the fourth energy policy dialogue that was between MEDI and DOE. And so we were talking about ways that our two countries can work closer together and collaborate. Following that short meeting in Fukushima, we had a tour of both Fukushima local regional governments and at Miyagi-Ken, where we were discussing kind of what their thoughts were for energy policy in the future. And I think right now is a very critical time for Japan as they develop their energy roadmap and figure out where they're going. And once that's decided here, probably in the next several months, that it'll be more clear to universities, to industry, and what direction is needed, and make this acceleration to a carbon neutral society quicker and more efficient. So I think it'll be interesting. This year ahead will be very exciting. And I'm looking forward to coming back to Japan. I just finished up a 2-year Mike Mansfield fellowship where I spent a year in Japan, and now I'm back in the US, but this is my first time back here, so I'm happy to be here. So today there's going to be about several items that I'm going to discuss. So I am the last speaker, so I apologize if some of this is repeated, but I will go into some depth on the U.S. Department of Energy's research and trying to highlight some of the collaborations that we've had with I²CNER or with various U.S. universities and research facilities. And then I'll be talking about our Fuel Cell Technologies program, some of those collaborations, and then maybe some of our priorities. Just last week, David Danielson, the Assistant Secretary for the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Division of DOE, which we are part of in the Fuel Cell Technologies program, talked about how important innovation was and data liberation and how that's such an engine of the economy. So I will go through some of what he said, and which will really direct all of DOE and EERE as we think about these collaborations. So starting off, I think it's really important to consider why are we here, why are we in this room. If we think about the environmental impacts of pollution, healthcare, and so on, think about a focus on an emission-free energy production and transportation. It will take a long transition, and I think it's important as we look at CCS and we look at shale gas that we use these fuels wisely as a transition and keep our eye on the goal, and to be flexible to be able to manage that transition and to rethink where we're going as technologies change. There's so much innovation happening in the world, it's very difficult to keep track of the progress and where we are. Second is energy security, this availability of fuels and cost. I think right now as we look at other parts of the world, there are economies that are going to large-scale renewable energy, and there's a lot of renewable energy for each region, each economy. It's just trying to figure out when will we reach that cost parity, how long will it take. And there's economic concerns, right? If your renewable energy or whatever source you're looking at is too costly, it's going to slow down your economy and your international competitiveness. So you need to find a way to balance those societal issues versus this pure economic drive. And I think that's why I²CNER is so important in what they're doing and in looking at research and working with industry. So if you think about diffuse renewable energy, it takes a while to build that out. And you look at distributed generation, the popularity of smart grids, we're going to see a lot more local development versus centralized production. And I think the next 5 years are going to be really interesting as we look at electric drives, transportation and alternative fuels. Who here in this room has driven an electric drive vehicle, or a pure electric vehicle for that matter? I see no hands. Come on, Toyota did 30% of their vehicles. There's got to be a few drivers in here. Okay, I guess people are too tired. One last item, just on a more serious note. I think that after Fukushima, that Japan is really having a hard time dealing with energy. And I extend my heartfelt kind of condolences in thinking about what happened, and I really want to extend that the DOE wants to help however we can. Recently, the US has dealt with this as well at a very much smaller scale with Hurricane Sandy. So we had a couple days where we were out at work at DOE. We had a lot of subways that were submerged with water in New York. I think the estimates were upwards of $30 billion in terms of the damage. And so when you start thinking about disaster recovery and resiliency, it's really important to balance that short-term economic gain with kind of a longer-term view of the future. So where are we going? I think renewable energy is moving faster than most people kind of can see. As you look here, this kind of almost exponential growth curve, it's going to be very interesting to understand, is that going to plateau at some point, or can it continue? And as we watch international publications that gather this information, it's really going to show where societies are going. Wind energy is growing so fast that it's really difficult to keep it connected. In China last year, there were 60 gigawatts of wind put in, but they were only able to connect 45 gigawatts. So you really need this analysis that's happening at I²CNER, that we're doing at DOE, and I'll talk about this grid integration later, in order to match that growth so that it can be as efficient as possible. But I think as people here in this room think about it, there's going to be a lot more headlines about how fast we're moving towards renewable energy. So in the last 5 years or so within the US, we have a tremendous amount of wind resources in the Midwest, and we've just begun to tap that. So you can see here in about 5 years, we've had a 100 terawatt hour increase. So this is not capacity where you have to divide that by 5 to get some, what it actually is. This is real electricity produced. And if you were to look at the number of nuclear power plants that would need to be built in that same time frame, you'd have 7 2-gigawatt nuclear power plants. I think it's been almost 30 years since we've had a new nuclear power plant, though there are licenses and some that are going in Georgia and so on. But this kind of shows you the rate that renewable energy can grow when you have just some minor policy support. So looking at wind in Japan, you can see in Hokkaido there's a tremendous amount of wind. This is a slide from Dr. Ushiyama-san. He talked at this JREF Foundation in March of this year. But if you look at METI's kind of fairly conservative estimate, going from almost 3,000 total gigawatts of potential, going down to about, I don't know, 40, 50 gigawatts. And so this is trying to understand where can those windmills go, what's reasonable from a societal point of view if you're looking at offshore and onshore. And then the Ministry of Environment was a little bit more aggressive, factoring in some of the feed-in tariffs that can really accelerate that introduction. And there's upwards of 300 gigawatts of potential available. So I think Japan has a lot of wind resources. There's a lot of pumped hydro here, more than anywhere else in the world, with 27 gigawatts of energy storage. And I think it needs to be considered as there's this thinking about moving towards your energy mix and how you can do it at the lowest cost. This is some of the renewable energy forecasts from METI. I think this was from July of this year, so I'm not sure how these numbers will play out in the next several months. But we're looking at least 2.5 gigawatts of energy coming in. So it is moving fast. That's a 10% increase in a year. I think the previous 10 years, there was about a 1% increase in renewable energy. So you're getting a 10 times increase from a single policy that's well thought out. This next few months, again, is going to be interesting to see where the cost committee puts those feed-in tariffs and how much they might come down. So this is a slide from a European Wind Association that kind of talks about job growth from renewable energy and wind, how much money is put back into R&D. So if you look at other industries, almost 10% of their turnover and profit from the wind energy goes into this local R&D rather than just profits and dividends. You can look at there's GDP benefits, there's avoided costs for fuel, but you need to be able to think about how do you tally those benefits from renewable energy. It's not just cost, but there's tax revenue increases, there's education, there's regional development, there's a lot of external benefits, trade balance, that aren't necessarily calculated when you think about this transition. So shifting gears, what do we do when we have a lot of renewable energy? Germany just hit 25% for the first half of this year of their economy, and they can't build out the transmission fast enough. We saw, as Hiroshi showed, that they're starting to look at power to gas, ways to use that excess wind to green their natural gas infrastructure. So I think hydrogen is one of these options for energy storage. There's many different ways that you can produce it, whether it's fossil fuels or renewable energy. And then as we saw before, there's many diverse applications. And that scalability is one of its strengths and its flexibility, but also makes it difficult to introduce hydrogen. You don't know where to focus, and you don't want to kind of diffuse your funding that you have. This is DOE's outlook of kind of by volume and size potential. So by far, natural gas is the fuel of today for producing hydrogen. Over 95% is produced of hydrogen today is produced from natural gas. Half of that going to just petroleum, gasoline reformation, kind of cleaning up that crude oil. And we'll probably need more of that as we start to think about tar sands and kind of fuels that aren't as easy to burn. Then moving forward, we have biomass. I think there was a cellulosic ethanol breakthrough this year where they were able to take waste materials and transform that into fuel. But this biomass gasification is another way to go about that, where you're focusing on waste. And I may have a slide later on this. Coal gasification with CCS, we heard quite a bit about that earlier today. It was an extremely interesting talk. I'm very interested in the time frame and when we'll start to see that commercially available. Electrolysis, high temperature electrolysis, this direct splitting of solar thermal temperature electrolysis, and then direct water splitting, so that you don't need to go through that additional step of making electricity. Then you can see here, this is the distributed generation, where if we were going to make hydrogen at the refueling station, at the neighborhood region where it might be needed, bus depot, versus the central up top. So the hydrogen market is growing. We can see here there's over 50 million tons of hydrogen produced, and that's expected to increase here considerably. And in 2010, you can see here this breakdown of both refining and ammonia products is the majority of that hydrogen. So this is the overview of our program. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. This systems integration and analysis, that tells us where does the program need to go. So rather than project management, where you're focused on a month-by-month go, no-go decision, program management is trying to figure out where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 10 years? What's the direction of research and technology progress versus your high-level mission and goals? At the heart of the research and development of our program is the fuel cell. How do we reduce cost? How do we extend durability? And I'll show a bit more on that. This fuel R&D is hydrogen delivery. Mark Pastor was my mentor in learning about hydrogen delivery here up front. Storage, I managed some of the Engineering Center of Excellence, where we had about 10 labs and universities that were all working towards looking at new ways, materials storage. And I think that interdisciplinary nature was really important, and that's why I looked to I²CNER and what Japan WPI has put together, and how important it is to have that close contact of these researchers with a diverse background. Underneath that is manufacturing R&D. How can we get from a batch process to continuous flow manufacturing, accelerate quality control? Safety codes and standards is a really important area for learning best practices and for international collaboration. Much of this research around the fuel cell is very competitive, because it is so close to market. But as you think about safety codes and standards, regulations, codes and standards, you really need to have that buy-in from multiple governments in order to share information and not to make mistakes twice. Education is part of that as well. And at the forefront, at the public-facing area, we have this technology transformation, market transformation. This is where we're looking at how do we get that technology out there. There's a big difference from taking something from a bench scale, from a microscope, to putting it in a customer's hands, right? You walk through industrial plants. If anybody been here through kind of the deep heart of an industrial area where you've got either energy production or materials production, there's noise, there's gases, there's hisses. You don't want to bring that next to a school or next to somebody's house. You have to get through that learning curve of bringing that maturity up from a different expectation for an industrial sector into a commercial environment. And it's very difficult. And I think we're going to be learning a lot in the next year as multiple countries and regions start putting in 100 refueling stations in their respective areas. There's a lot to be learned. This is our updated roadmap and kind of program plan from 2011. So this is available on our website to give an idea of kind of where we're looking at. And this is updated from 2006. We have over 300 projects that are currently funded, both at industry, national labs, and universities. So this here, I think this is a really important slide as we think about kind of where clean tech industry is going. By far the leader is fuel cells as we look at the number of patents relative to other clean energy initiatives. You can see here US and Japan are clearly leading, and I think if the US and Japan want to maintain that leadership, there needs to be close collaboration and partnership, and that's why I think I²CNER is important. This energy policy dialogue, we'll have the 5th one next year. Being able to get our industries to work close together and to move quickly into this space, because the manufacturing ramp up is going to be critical to finding an economic kind of endpoint. So you can see here that it's not just the US, there's multiple countries that are working in this area. There's literally billions of dollars over 5-year research plans, well thought out, that are going into this area. I think it's just a matter of time as you combine this level of research money with clear energy policy before this vehicles are commercialized. And that it's going to happen a lot faster than people might expect. So you can see here the number of units shipped. It's increasing every year. There's been a tremendous number of residential fuel cells. I think cumulative 45,000, almost 60,000 residential fuel cells in Japan. And that's just amazing to think about from just a few years ago. Why fuel cells? I don't think I need to go into this. It's really about the efficiency, right? We can do some cogeneration. There are some other advanced technologies for combustion that can get beyond this 40%, but it'll be interesting to see when they're actually available. The 60% efficiency is possible as you reduce that heat and you reduce kind of the noise and friction, everything else, where you don't have those moving parts. One thing I might mention here is one difference between distributed energy generation and centralized production. That central production has a 30, 40, 60-year life. That means that plant, that sunk capital cost, cannot be updated for 60 years. You're stuck with that technology for 60 years. If your technology has a 10-year life, 20-year life, at the end of that cycle, you can revamp it and introduce new innovations. You can adjust to whatever your society has moved toward. But when you sink money, considerable sums of money into one central place, it's hard to shift. And I think that distributed generation will go faster than people are expecting as you look in the past. So general electrical energy efficiency, you can see steam turbines. It was interesting to hear that we're at a 300-year anniversary. And then looking at fuel cells and this broad stretch of where that efficiency might be and going. I think the battery is going out. Oh, thank you. This is our funding. So for 2012 and then 2013, we're still in a continuing resolution. That means our budget has not been passed. So we're looking at, right now it's about 80 million is what is requested, but the House mark is around 80 million and the Senate is 104. So once those, the House and Senate come to some compromise, our funding may be somewhere in between those two. We're looking at sometime around March before we can kind of reevaluate where our funding is and what projects can start or be continued or closed out. Okay. Okay. So if we look here, you can see this is a little kind of a heads up, simple chart that talks about how we choose which projects and maybe which partners we want to work with. So you think about this high risk and this high impact, right? That's the role of government in long-term R&D. So we need to figure out that balance of being near-term where we can support the economy versus this long-term direction. For fuel cells, we want to get to non-platinum metal group catalysts, liquid-based fuel cells. There's a lot of technology that's happening as we try to reduce the cost. My favorite here is this low temperature cold gas. I think this technology, it's being commercialized by BMW. They're going to have rolling prototype here shortly. And this will get us to that 1,000-kilometer vehicle. You might say, I don't need 1,000 kilometers. That's too far. I never drive that distance. But if you think about only refueling once a month and how much time you save over the life of that vehicle, that starts to add up. And as long as you're not losing hydrogen, which is one of the challenges, I think high capacity is important. Right now we're focused at 5 kilograms or 300-mile range. But if you can start thinking about 600-mile range, higher, that there's a lot of advantage. And this is what customers kind of expect. They want this technology to improve. They're tired of kind of waiting for things to happen. And we see that in the battery space with cell phones, right? How many 5-inch cell phones have we seen come out in the last year? And how many of those can last it through a full day or two? We need to find a new way to store energy, and I think capacity is critical, and that's what customers expect. So this is one of our major achievements. So in the course, I'll try this other, not quite working. So one of the advances here is going over the last decade or so, we've had more than an 80% reduction in cost. I must caution you, this is at very high manufacturing volume. So this is not what you can buy a fuel cell stack today. This is projected with the economies of scale built in. But you can see down here at this lower chart that the economies of scale drop quite rapidly. You can get to 50,000 units. You can get most of the way down that cost curve. That's why it's so critical to ramp up manufacturing and to be able to have all the codes, regulations, standards, education in place so that you can move down that curve as quickly as possible. Another area of kind of showing how we've got to that is by being very detailed, very specific in the last 2 years, concentrating on where are the challenges, how much money can we drive out, right? To get from that $50 a kilowatt down to about $30 a kilowatt, this last stretch is going to be very difficult. So we need to focus, right? Is it balance of plant? Is it the bipolar plate, a catalyst? We need to have a lot of feedback with the national labs, with researchers, university, and where available with industry, trying to understand what's the last bit to get you down that cost curve. But I think this non-platinum metal catalyst is going to be really important for that cost reduction. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, if the mouse will work. There we go. All right. Thanks. So I talked earlier a little bit about distributed generation, and we heard about, right, the thousands of fuel cells being introduced, residential fuel cells in Japan. You can see here that the stationary fuel cell cost reduction is another kind of important metric to meeting our 2020 target. You can see here This can be biogas capable, so there is a renewable energy pathway once it does become cost competitive with natural gas. I don't think I want to spend too much time on this. This combined heat and power and distributed generation, right? Trying to understand what is needed at that local level, right? Exactly how much heat is consumed, right? One of the reasons that the fuel cell is only 700 watts for that Japanese home is because it needs to be balanced by the hot water use, right? You need to think very closely about that cogeneration to get to the high efficiencies. So if you look at this range of efficiencies, it depends on how well you can utilize that excess heat. So we have supermarkets. The new trade center had 12 fuel cells measuring about 5 megawatts. I think Apple just put in 5 megawatts. AT&T has over 17 megawatts, I think, worth of fuel cells in the US. After Hurricane Sandy, I think there were about 23 fuel cell installations in the New York area. And of those 23, 22 of them continued to run, and the one that didn't, it was a problem with the fan or with the cooling system, not with the fuel cell itself. So they are proving themselves in the field on this disaster recovery and resilience. I talked about safety codes and standards earlier. There's a lot of information here. I just want to say that this is one of our strongest areas in the program for sharing information. We have an h2incidents.org database. This is where industry stakeholders, auto manufacturers, and station providers can share information. So if they have a problem with the station, they don't have to say who they are, where they are, but they can say, this is kind of the issue that we had, and this is what people that are putting in new stations should think about. So I think it's really important to have a place to share information that's vetted and that has this kind of a cross-border reach. Because no country can do it alone. It's costly, and we need to accelerate that introduction as quickly as possible. And that happens through collaboration and learning. We have a lot of policies for promoting fuel cells. This 30% tax credit. Right now, there's a proposed legislation moving that to 50% and applying for refueling stations. We have an H-Prize as well, looking at incentivizing, right, $1 million worth of prize money for a high-value hydrogen storage application. California, just a week ago, released about $30 million for station solicitations. So California is very focused on putting in refueling station, and they've coupled that with a sustainable policy that has tax revenue that doesn't need to be approved year to year, so that introduction of stations can continue. This early markets, early markets to reduce cost. I think right now you can see the specialty vehicles, forklifts, there's enormous market size for that. So there's a lot of interest. And I don't think I have it on this slide, maybe a following slide. But we have, I think, well, it'll come up, I think, on a later slide. So this is really important, right? How do you choose where do your fuel cells go? How do you prioritize your research funding? You need to understand where you can reach those economies of scale as quickly as possible. This is the slide I was looking for. So through the Recovery Act money in 2009, we funded about 1,400 cost shared, may have been 50% or slightly different number. Close to 1,000 of these fuel cell units was our goal, backup power, forklifts, and so on. After we did that, we had more than 5,000 purchases come in that were, 4,000 or so, that had no government incentive. They didn't have any funding from that Recovery Act. So this is a home run that we hit, that we just got lucky in being the sweet spot. We have the market pull right after the government just puts a little money into this and shows that it can work, helps with the refueling station introduction, right? A lot of meetings on indoor refueling, a lot of concerns on the tank cycling. They had these tanks that were rated for 1 or 2 fills a day, or 1 or 2 fills probably a month or a year, and they were refueling these tanks for 3 times a shift, right? So what does that cycling, what does that embrittlement do? Sandia was critical. I'm sure Petros Dr. Safranis consulted on that, but it was an enormous project that ramped up very quickly to solve this problem because we knew this deployment was happening so quickly. So US collaboration, we have a lot of work going on. So the International Energy Agency, we have a hydrogen implementing agreement. And so we have these 17 countries, or maybe more than that, I think I'm getting that mixed up with I²CNER, that are all kind of working to varying degrees on hydrogen. We also have this international partnership for hydrogen and fuel cells in the economy. So we just went through 10 years of having this partnership in place, and we're renewing it for another 5 years. And then it was really significant. I was just in Seville a couple weeks ago, and Japan took over the leadership and chair of that organization. I think it's so important to see what Japan's done in terms of vehicles, residential fuel cells, and really pushing hydrogen. And I think the rest of the countries were really wanted Japan to take that leadership role and kind of share information from what they've learned worked for them and how that might transfer to accelerating the introduction. We have a memorandum of agreements between NEDO, I²CNER, LANL, and I'm sure many other national labs. I apologize for not up. Well, okay, so this is infrastructure is going to be critical moving into this year, right? Multiple countries looking at tens, hundreds of refueling stations going in. But there was just 2 weeks ago in Spain, we had this energy storage workshop in conjunction with I²CNER. And it was amazing the level of detail and expertise there was in Europe, looking at the cost analysis, not just batteries, but compressed air, looking at different ways you can store that energy, right? They have a lot of energy coming into the grid. It's difficult to manage. There's only so much you can do with demand response and a strong mesh grid. At some point, you start needing to think about energy storage, and I think that's going to become a really important topic, large-scale energy storage moving into the next several years. That's something that, after being away from the program for a year, I was managing hydrogen delivery and infrastructure, and now I'm responsible for kind of making the layout and understanding where is hydrogen economical, where does it belong in this large-scale energy space. So I have a lot of freedom, and I'm trying to understand where this makes sense. I think it's a difficult economic case to make in the US, so I expect to be looking outside of the US to some degree to understand where's their policies, where there's high-value electricity that really does need that energy storage from either hydrogen and fuel cells or something else. I think analysis is a good place to share information, and then this increased collaboration on safety codes and standards that I talked about earlier. So I talked about earlier, we had a big meeting. There's some organizational changes happening within EERE. It'll be announced here shortly, I'm sure. But these are some of our cross-cutting initiatives. So rather than just having a fuel cell technologies program, a vehicles program, biomass, solar, we have these cross-cutting initiatives. So similar to I²CNER, where you have many different researchers, in this case, many different program managers, project managers, working across these siloed research or kind of areas so that you can share information, right? If you think about a smart grid, right, that's not just the Office of Electricity or Grid Management. You have vehicle technologies, you have batteries, storage, distributed generation. That can be either cogeneration, natural gas. There's a lot of expertise, and I think this cross-functional knowledge and a generalist is going to be really important to bring all of this data information together. Next generation semiconductors. The two highlights are clean energy manufacturing, right? Finding a way either for manufacturing renewable energy equipment or using renewable energy as part of your manufacturing process, right? There's an enormous potential as you think about negawatts. So this is a way of not just consuming power at an manufacturing location, but moving and shifting that peak load to the weekend or to another time so that you don't impact the grid. So these are things that are under clean energy manufacturing. And then in addition to energy storage, the other item that I'm working on, or a liaison from the fuel cell technology program is this grid integration. So how do we reduce the barriers for increased renewable energy in the US, right? There's a lot of kind of work and learning to be done, right? If you have a static central power plant, whether it's nuclear or coal, you have an uptime of 2 gigawatts that can be turned on over a day or two or less. That runs for 3 months or however long before you need to do your inspections, and then you shut that 2 gigawatts down. So how do you manage 2 gigawatt drop? We know how to do that really well. That's what utilities have been doing for the last 100 years. But now we want to think about wind energy and solar energy. It's got a daily cycle. You might have a 3-month cycle where that energy is going up by gigawatts, not just a couple. But if it is distributed, maybe you can turn these on here, you can do maintenance in a small area here and there, but how do you transfer those learnings and how that industry best operates or that energy production to a utility which is very conservative? They are required to have 100% uptime with extreme reliability, and how do you mesh this variable energy source with this requirement for 100% uptime? There's some interesting work at Siemens where they took about 5 different resources. I think it was natural gas, wind, I don't know about geothermal, but a few other items, and they were able to create a virtual power plant. It was an 80 megawatt power plant. By using weather forecasting, by using grid control, they were able to operate that just like they would expect a conventional power plant to operate. So I think there's a lot of effort going on around the world, and the US is moving in that area. We had 2 workshops in the last couple months, one on distribution with over 100 researchers, just focused on the distribution and upgrading the grid, trying to understand what R&D was needed. And then we had the same workshop a week or 2 later, looking at how do we do this for transmission, right? What can we do to, what research is needed, right? Has anybody heard of the third industrial revolution? Bunch of blank stares. So this is Jeremy Rifkin trying to understand this relationship between buildings, transportation, energy production. Okay, now I lost where I was going because nobody gave me an answer. But through this third industrial revolution, it's really important to tie those 3 items together. And I think in the US, we're going to be kind of updating. So security is important for the grid, and communication. It's not just electricity that's going to be flowing through those wires, but you need instantaneous communication to be able to control that varying production and demand. So this is that grid integration. You can see we have markets. The lowest cost option when you start thinking about managing your grid is demand management, right? Can you change the price? In Japan, there's a few smart grid options where they're allowing prices to fluctuate, right? Not just from 10 or 30 yen, but maybe to 300 yen. And that gives a price signal to turn off your electricity. But then at other times, that can be less than what you're used to pay for, right? Whether it's 25 yen or 30 yen, maybe it can be 10 yen. And you can decide when do you want to use the refrigerator. Either can be intelligently connected to do that. You can have smart chargers on electric vehicles. You can vary your heating and cooling to allow that flexibility. So that demand management's the easiest place to start, lowest cost. Then you start moving up the curve in managing that grid electricity, and you can think about spinning reserves, flywheels, maybe larger energy storage. But I think energy storage is the last thing you want to do as you start looking at upgrading and modernizing your grid. Some of the key accomplishments relative to hydrogen in this US-Japan collaboration. The Society of Automotive Engineers released this technical report, J2579, which is focused on tank testing. So in order to have a fuel cell vehicle, you want to be able to sell that everywhere, right? You don't want just your home market, you want to be able to export it. And if you don't have that tank testing agreed on and a confidence that there's not going to be problems, you won't reach that goal. And so this collaboration has been ongoing for almost 10 years and figuring out exactly what the testing protocol might be. The same on the refueling protocol, right? You want to have that interface between the refueling station and the vehicle to be very clear so that you don't overfuel your vehicle and that you don't underfill it and that you get the maximum capacity that you expect and that you pay for. This hydrogenous transition, right? I²CNER, sorry, I have this date wrong, it's 2010. But I think these core leadership roles, it's really important part of our collaboration and example of moving forward. I went to the International Forum in 2010, and that's one of the times where I really began to understand Japan. After this forum, I was able to visit Toyota, I was able to visit Honda, MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and each of these groups in some way were related to our program or providing input. This refueling protocol validation, that's going to be very important as we put these stations out there. There's still some challenges with J2601. It's very strict. If you need minus 40 degrees C pre-cooling, it can increase the station cost, and there's still material compatibility issues. So this is going to be a really important point for moving forward. The global technical regulations, we're moving towards phase 2 of this document on tank testing. I think at some point there may be a low temperature element to that. But these are some of the areas that I think that we're discussing now and negotiating for explicit research that's being done together. An example of some of the AIST and Sandia National Lab collaboration. This is hydrogenous. Brian Summerday was mentioned earlier. We can also see some of this work where we had these biannual workshops. There was a really high-level push from DOE to see where we could collaborate, and and the labs were put up as an example. Okay, this is perfect. They're doing similar research, but after a year or two, it was found, while we made this announcement, there wasn't funding for the researchers, and it was a big challenge. But I think the Sandia and through the relationship with Dr. Safranis and I²CNER, they were one of the shining examples that actually showed that it was possible and that it wasn't just a high-level announcement, that it actually had some meat to it. And it wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, without that close collaboration. You can see more on funding, safety codes and standards, again, trying to look at future collaborations. We heard a little bit about the Livermore Open Valley campus. So this is in California, where both Livermore and Sandia have a outside the fence. So right, there's a lot of sensitive development that goes on there. It's difficult for foreign researchers to come onto the campus. And so having this outside the campus area where there's still access to these really high-level tools and powerful diagnostics is important. And I think this will be another avenue, very specific and concrete for future collaboration. So digging down into the middle of this is an international energy agency based in Paris, and this hydrogen implementing agreement. You can see there's a tremendous number of tasks that are happening, all focused on hydrogen. My animation, you can see here, Kyushu, ICE, they're part of this storage materials task. There was just a meeting here, I think just last month in Tokyo on this topic. This task 28, this is what I helped start with Marcel Wiede from the Netherlands, and that'll be coming to a conclusion here, I think at the end of this coming year. But Tokyo Gas, Nissan, they've been really valuable in providing input and understanding how do we build out that infrastructure, what's the most efficient options, right? How do you get through this hydrogen production to getting it to the vehicle, the lowest cost? There's a lot of information out there. It's just how do you get it publicized? And then we have this global hydrogen system analysis, task 30. I think this might have been mentioned earlier. Where's the hydrogen going to come from? There's a really in-depth analysis going on through the IEA and working closely through this IPHE to understand where is natural gas moving from, where is coal moving from. I don't see the coal to Japan and China down here, but this overview of understanding energy flows in the world from these different primary energy sources and understanding what's the lowest cost, what's unintended consequences. Just for example here, I think I'm down to my last 20 seconds or so. with a low-cost natural gas, right? We're at historic low cost of $2 a million BTU. Meanwhile, it's upwards of $15, $20 a million BTU for LNG. Of course, there's some energy and you have transport for that cost in Japan and Asia. But what happened is the US had, over a period of just 5 years, had to go from gasifiers on our coasts to considering liquefiers. There's going to be a natural gas LNG report released from DOE this week for public comment. So I know Japan is very interested in understanding when that import can start. But what happened is we stopped importing natural gas from the Middle East. That freed up natural gas in the Middle East to go to Europe. That depressed prices there, putting the pressure on Russia, right? So it's not just one country and another country, but there's a domino effect as you think about the flows of energy, right? I'm no way an expert on this. I'm just repeating what I said, but you can imagine this for a hydrogen society or hybrid, where you're looking at this hybrid of electricity, energy storage, renewables. It's very difficult to think about where this energy will come from and what's the best path forward. But they're really large corporations, right? The heavy industries in Japan are serious about this. They're doing studies. They're looking at large-scale, right, 10-ton a day liquefiers for moving hydrogen around. These plans are in process. Pilot scales on the order of 700 tons of liquid hydrogen every day being moved across water. That's being considered now. I think this is going to be really critical to understand where that energy goes and how long it takes. So these are collaborations. I think I'm just about over. You can see we have to do a lot of work with other agencies. We have, just now there's a biofuel credit, and we're looking at whether or not hydrogen can be part of that. Pete Devlin has been really critical in leveraging resources from other agencies. DOE can't do it alone. It's not just the hydrogen program that's going to do it. It's going to be the Department of Interior, Department of Transportation. We actually have somebody from Department of Transportation working in our group now, 20% of his time to help out managing safety codes and standards. And that shows kind of collaboration that it can't be done alone. I was talking to Mehdi on just yesterday morning about, right, what do we do with safety, right? We want to share information on safety codes and standards. Maybe we want to understand how can foreign fuel cell vehicles come into Japan. They said, we hadn't thought about that, but safety is not what we do. We do hydrogen policy promotion. You need to go to the 3rd floor and talk to KHK. So I think in March, I'm going to try to start that dialogue and try to understand where can DOE help, where can we start new collaborations. So thank you for letting me go on for so long. I don't see too many people sleeping, so hopefully I kept you guys awake and that you learned a little bit here. I'm always open for questions. We have our annual merit review coming up here in May. Actually, on Monday, NEDO is holding its annual review for hydrogen and fuel cell technology review. And I think probably in the first time in history, possibly, they'll have a US employee there, myself, to say a few words and to help review projects. So I think this is an example of this collaboration moving forward. For the last 10 years plus, we've had this hydrogen review open to researchers from all over the world, right? We have 1,000 people, 2,000 people come for these reviews. And now it's an opportunity for us to come and share knowledge and to work closer with Japan. So thank you very much for your time. And here's my contact information.